Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens, one of our horticultural forums. We're delighted to host another one for you. We will be recording this as well, so if you're not seeing this live, you'll be seeing it another time. My name's Claire Hart. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the Royal Botanic Gardens Melbourne. I'm here today with Tessa Cum, who also is the Secretariat for the Alliance. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we're presenting to today, where I'm coming from, which is the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and also welcome any First Nations people listening or seeing this today. We have a great session lined up for you today. And I will introduce Sam Brockington, Professor and Curator at Cambridge University Botanic Gardens in Cambridge. And we're going to be talking about an article that was recently published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, and it's insights from a century of data that reveal global trends in ex situ living plant collections. Sorry, I've quite mushed that up. A really dynamic and amazing article that I've recently read. It opens up and prompts new questions on our collections, particularly in regards to have we reached capacity, have we reached in our accessions, and also peak diversity. Incredibly interesting. It's a must read. I've passed it on to all the horticultural team that I work with as something that they need to read to progress our work. So it's not an article that you read and put down. It's something that we'll be continuing to revisit. So, Sam, I'll ask you to give us some background and understanding of the work that you've done, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thanks everyone for coming. And I hope everyone who sees the recording gets value out of it as well. So, so this work was published just 2 or 3 weeks ago. I'm going to be presenting a talk that I put together before the paper came out, but that's fine. And for me, this is really about understanding the dynamics of living plant collections, and to give you some perspective on the journey that we went on for this. This actually started as a pandemic project when we were, stuck at home, wondering quite what to do with ourselves, and we have an interest in data in my team and in the sort of garden that I work in, and we were just thinking about ways in which we can use data, and what we were particularly we in 2019, like just literally a couple of months before the pandemic hit, we had just published our living collection strategy, which you can find online, and it's relatively quantitative in its approach, and we were interested in developing tools that allow us to iteratively measure our collections and the progress we're making towards quantitative goals in the living collection strategy. And so, behind this paper, and this is probably, I think, even more important when you talk about what comes after this paper and how do you to take aspects of this paper forward. Behind this paper is a whole set of tools and a software package that we call BG Smart R, and we did a whole workshop on that in Singapore, and that's a set of tools designed to take the contents of a living collections database and just analyze it in a million different ways automatically. And so it generates too many graphs, if we're honest, but it will look at your collections management and progress and everything through many different lenses, sort of through time. So we're working to release that now with BGCR, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Anyway, that's the preamble. So excuse me. In terms of the paper itself, I'd like to just begin by acknowledging a couple of people who did a lot of the heavy lifting. First, the one is Angela Khanna. She's the first author on the paper who did a lot of the coding. Jake Powell came in at a very critical time, and he's a very good computer programmer. He also was instrumental in this. Then the collections team, And then none of this would be possible without the collections who contributed their collections data. And then by extension, we got to acknowledge, many past and present, generally unsung people, curators, collection managers, horticulturists who generate that data and input it into the databases. Okay, so I've been interested in data for a long time in terms of living collections data, and in 2017, when I came into a couple of years into my job in Cambridge Botanic Gardens, we published what I still think is the biggest global analysis of our living collections generally. And to do that, we collaborated with the BGCI, and we took data for about 1,000 gardens worldwide, which is everything in BGCI's plant search repository, to basically ask the question about, how much diversity are we growing worldwide, and sort of a few related questions to that. So as a result of that, we can say we're growing collectively a minimum of 105,000 species, minimum of 10,000 genera, minimum of so many plant families, and so forth. And we were able to look at threatened collections as well, and sort of benchmark what we were doing in that space as well. Now, it was I think an important paper, as a statement. It was if I was to sort of be pejorative about it, it was basically bean counting. And it didn't, it gave a sense of what our capacity was, or sort of how much we were doing as a community, but it didn't really, it was limited in terms of, I think, looking under the hood in terms of what was going on. And that's because it was what you might call a snapshot analysis. It just looked at the collections in a sort of single point of time. And so what we really wanted to do, or what I became increasingly interested in, was the power of longitudinal analysis. And that was, that applies to the level of an individual garden, but also if you extrapolate out to the sort of the global community. So in a longitudinal analysis, you're looking at how things change over time, and that gets very, very powerful. So what we did sort of between 2001 and 2004, and it doesn't sort of sound like as much work as it was, but we basically ended up with 50 collections worth of data. But behind that, there were hundreds of interviews with people around the world, which was very interesting to connect to our curator and collections community, and sort of at a personal level, and sort of see what the stuff people are wrestling with. We learned a lot from that. But we also, so we got probably about 90 collections shared their data, and of those 90, only 50 were of the right sort of quality and shape to be part of this analysis. So we took those 50 collections. Currently, those 50 collections are growing 500,000 accessions amongst them. Currently, they're growing about 41% of the diversity that we previously estimated from the paper was grown in botanic gardens. So that, it's a very significant subset of the, even if it's only 50 gardens. And from them, we got, it's actually not 1.9, but 2.2 million records, and we analyzed that data over 100 years. And I'm gonna race through the major findings now. So when you look at that data, so we glommed all of the data together into what we call a metacollection. So we're not distinguishing individual gardens. This is all gardens combined. And what you find is you get what's called a sigmoidal growth curve. So sigmoidal growth curves are the things you always see in resource-limited biological systems. So if you're growing E. coli on a plate, or you're counting the number of muntjac deer in your garden eating your plants, over time, they're going to reach a carrying capacity, which is the amount that ecosystem can support. And so, in hindsight, it's not surprising, I suppose, to find sigmoidal growth curves in botanic garden collections, because we are resource limited, space limited, time limited, people limited, money limited institutions. But what's important is where we are on that sigmoidal growth curve. And what we found is that 80% of the institutions in the metacollection have plateaued, have reached carrying capacity, or are decreasing in their collection size. So Just my power supply is just running, so I should have checked this before.
Not a problem.
Just get my so yeah, so we reached peak capacity. We reached it in 2008. I wouldn't worry too much about that date particularly. It may or may not be accurate for various reasons. But the curve itself is definitely true. Um, and so why do we, what are the dynamics underlying that sigmoidal growth curve? Well, the population dynamics, if you like, of a botanic garden are relatively simple, because the size of our collections is determined by what we're bringing in every year and what's going out every year. And so essentially, we bring stuff in more and more stuff in. As we bring more and more stuff in, the rate of death also increases, and eventually the rate of death or loss of accessions from the collection equals what's coming in. So then it peaks, and then if loss exceeds incoming, then it begins to decline. So we all know that we're working with extremely dynamic stroke transient systems. That's our big challenge. That's why data management in living collections is so uniquely complex. And so effectively we can say that, by 2008, the loss, which was about 20,000 accessions a year in this meta collection, so about 5% of the meta collection every year is going out the door. And that's what we have to contend with. And that's, really fundamental in terms of many of the challenges we face. Okay, so not only have we reached peak capacity, but we've also reached peak diversity. And I think the interesting thing is that we reached peak diversity long before we reached peak capacity, by about 20 years. So you can look at diversity metrics in many different ways. So you can look at them at different hierarchical levels: family, genera, species. You can look at phylogenetic diversity as a concept. I won't go into that now, but however you look at it, they peak before capacity, and that's for lots of reasons. One is to do with the fact that taxonomic hierarchies are inclusive. So families are more likely to peak before genera. Genera are more likely to peak before species. Species are more likely to peak before accessions. This is because of there's duplication going on, of course. That's both within and between collections, which is another reason why diversity peaks ahead of total capacity. But it must also be a reflection of horticultural know-how. Like at some point, we're kind of growing everything that's in our horticultural lexicon. The sort of basic horticultural language that we grow. So that's an element of that too. But if you look on the right hand side, this is just phylogenetic diversity as a peak, which is a measure that's slightly independent from taxonomic hierarchies. And when you look at that, I mean, that peaked in 1990, and then and when the collections were 75% of their current size. So basically, it's telling us that phylogenetic diversity, we can increase our capacity by another quarter and not necessarily bring any more sort of diversity into the system. And that's an important thing to sort of reflect on, I think. Okay. So the first two slides don't surprise me in hindsight, but the next ones I think are much more of a surprise in a way. So one of the things then what we did is look at how provenance changes over time, and we just used the basic provenance code. So wild, derived, garden, and unknown. And what we were able to show is that interesting things happen with provenance over time. So one is that we get unknown as a general category decreases. But it's worth reflecting that in 2021, about 30% of this meta collection was unknown provenance, which is sort of shocking, and demonstrates what a challenge we have about transparent provenance sourcing or data management and that kind of thing. The other thing to sort of see is, well, garden origin is sort of more or less constant across the 100-year span, but wild origin is something that really increases over time. But then it peaks in 1993, and then it begins to level off. And there's this kind of trade-off, which I suspect all of us understand as collection managers. There's this trade-off between wild collecting and garden origin. And at least in our garden, because we have a steady state loss every year, we're losing stuff. We have to bring in, I would say, probably about 500 to 1,000 plants a year just to maintain our steady state in the garden. If we can't bring that in as wild, we'll bring it in some other way. We'll pop down to the local garden nursery, or we'll go down to Kew, or whatever we have to do, we'll bring stuff in. And so there's a trade-off there. And we apparently reached what we're calling peak wild in 1993. So after that, things begin to decline. So then the question is, why do you reach peak wild in 1993? So what we then did, so this first graph is a sort of percentage of maximum size, but it's looking at the sort of the whole collection. So in the graph on the right, what we're now doing is looking at the number of new accessions coming in each year. So we're just looking at the new accessions coming in each year and asking how many of those were wild, how many were garden, and so forth. And so what you can see here is the sort of new accessions rather than total garden accessions, which sort of dilutes the signal a bit. Then when you look at new accessions, you see this incredibly sharp peak at 1990, basically 1992, 93, and then it shoots downwards. And that, what we've attributed to that in the paper, and the way we're talking about it is CBD. Like, it's very difficult to come up with any other correlate that would explain that peak other than CBD coming in 1993, and then wild collecting massively being impacted by CBD and effectively dropping by about 44% before it reaches a new kind of steady state. And you don't really. One of the things that makes one really believe that CBD is that it's an effect that's really uniquely impacting on wild provenance and none of the others really, right? So you're looking at CBD has a big effect on wild collecting. So now, therefore, one could ask another question, which is, okay, if CBD is having an effect on wild collecting, then it must be also having an effect on material crossing international boundaries. I mean, can we pick up that signal in another way? So that's the same graph on the left. Then what we did on the right was say, okay, let's split this meta collection into native versus non-native and ask, can we see a signal there? So we were asking of the material that gardens were bringing in, how much of it was outside of their geopolitical boundary and how much was within their geopolitical boundary to which that institution sits across, but then multiplied by 50 institutions. And so again, what you find, it's slightly less clean, which actually I'm quite happy about because I don't think CBD ratification was a clean ratification. What you see is that same peak in non-native material, right? And annoyingly, I can't, let me see if I can move you guys. There we go. So here's the peak. There's a kind of double peak here. Not quite sure what it's about, but I mean, there's we haven't got enough data to smooth out all of the noise really. Then it declines, and that's about a 39% decline in international material. Then the inverse, you've got native material not affected. But then what you've got is this really interesting kind of there's a second, what looks like a second decline to me. I didn't really comment on this on the paper, but that is, for me, that's about 2014, 2015. And for European gardens, Nagoya was really like strongly impacting us around 2014. So I suspect, but didn't have the courage or the kind of evidence to say it in the paper, that this is really around the impact of Nagoya, and I suspect we're going to see another big decline. But what's interesting is that gardens are responding because we have to bring in the material we need every year to sustain the collections at their steady state. And so what you're seeing is an increase in gardens focusing on native material. And it's not just about, responding to legislation, because of course there is for you guys in Australia and places that are more biodiverse in the UK, there is this big focus on native material and how we can do that. So it's, I'm not putting it all on the legislation, but, effectively what we're seeing, if we extrapolated this to the whole world, is a de-globalization of our collections and an increasing regionalization of them, which is, it's neither good or bad. I mean, it's difficult for kind of global North European botanic gardens that have this very much a concept of sort of the world in a bottle type collection mentality. I think it has implications on, are we bringing diversity into areas of scientific sort of concentration and excellence where that diversity can be studied? I think there's lots of things, but then on the other hand, there's something more equitable about this. It reflects local regional ownership. I think it reflects, if one wanted to do ecological restoration work, for example, it makes much more sense if that diversity is regionally held. But I think, it has huge implications for how we manage our network. If we're not holding the world in a bottle and you want to access and study a particular diversity, and botanic gardens are a route to getting access to that diversity, then it means somehow we need to be able to have a better data insight into where stuff is growing and how to access it. And if we want to keep mobilizing diversity for a variety of reasons, if it is more dispersed, if it is a more dispersed distribution and network, then I think that brings some interesting challenges. I guess what I'm trying to say. By the way, I'm very happy if people want to interrupt and save you listening to my voice for however long. If people have questions as we go along, I should have said that.
I've got some questions set up that I want to put to participants at the end. So crack on, and then we will all get into it. Elbows out. Fine.
Yeah. And tell me if you need me to wrap up, because I haven't timed this necessarily. But basically, I would say, my catchphrase is we've reached peak capacity, peak diversity, peak wild, and peak global. And we're coming down the other side, for whatever that means. Then the question is, okay, so that's affecting collections as a whole. Is it affecting, is our ability to do ex situ conservation somehow insulated from this? So then we can subset that meta-collection and just look at the threatened plants and do very similar analyses. And so on the right, this is just threatened plants, looking at the number of new accessions coming in. So it's a sort of a subset of the graph on the left, just looking at threatened plants. Again, in orange, you can see the peak and wild. It comes down, but not as much. But what's interesting is that blue line, which is garden origin. That's what interests me here, because that is gardens basically sharing threatened plants peer to peer, I would say. And that's increasing a lot post CBD. And I would say probably because gardens are struggling to get them from the wild, and there's this kind of cultural pressure to sort of work, or peer pressure to work on threatened plants, to have them in our collections, to showcase them. Maybe, I mean, you don't have to be as cynical as I'm being, but and because they can't actually get them from the wild, they're just recycling. But of course, that has implications for how useful our meta collection is in terms of a population for ecological restoration, or just simple keeping species breeding, or having ex situ breeding populations, and all of these things that I think we don't achieve, but maybe aspire to, or tell the world that we are doing. We're gardens are bringing in as many garden origin threatened plants as they are wild origin, and that's probably not the place we want to be in for ex situ conservation. And then you can ask, well, are threatened species also, do they show the same sigmoidal pattern? And the answer is almost. So they're lagging slightly behind in this curve, but you can see they're beginning to plateau at the top there. And there's some graphs we put in the paper that aren't in this talk, so they were requested as part of the peer review. So I might touch on those too. But this is threatened plants are beginning to plateau. So then you can ask, well, why is it lagging? And one of the explanations for why it's lagging is simply that threatened species are by definition harder to acquire, because usually, their threat designation involves some kind of limited distribution. And so when then we could argue, well, that's hard to test, but you could compare it to endemics, which is what we did. And when you look at endemics, the blue line, it shows a very similar curve of accumulation. So probably, one of the reasons why threatened species lag behind is because they're simply hard to get hold of, for whatever reason. Endemics show the same pattern. And then, because this is where longitudinal gets really uncomfortably incisive about what's going on, is that you can then say, okay, when the red lists really started to come in as a phenomenon in 1980 versus now, what impact has that had on our behavior? Right. And so the slightly frightening thing is, in 1980, we were bringing in 3% of our new accessions that came in, 3% were threatened. Go forward 40 years, and that's only increased to 4%. You got these big outliers, and blame this on the Australians. This is your Mount Annan outlier, right? So there are ways to bring in a ton of diversity. But you can see the problem on the right is that our change in behavior, our response to threat is incremental, but the accumulation of threat designation is not incremental, right? So threat designation is increasing at a kind of probably near exponential rate in orange, and this is us in blue. So there's a real mismatch there in terms of I think the scale of the challenge, how we communicate our response to the world, and how we're actually responding. In fact, the response is so bad, one could ask, is response the right word, right? Because again, with the longitudinal data sets, you can say, are we actually responding to the act of a species becoming threatened? So is a species more likely to be incorporated in the collection after it's acquired a threat designation, after it's perceived to be threatened? And the answer is no. So there's a huge disconnect between IUCN designations and what we're doing on the ground. Sorry, shut the door. Okay. Then one can ask. Then one can look at the other thing one can do longitudinally is look at survival curves. So within this data, we can ask, when does the species come in and when does it die, and we can times that by 2.2 million records, and begin to ask, what is the survival probability on average across the collection? How does that subset by different categories? And we looked at various different categories in the paper. But when it comes to threatened species, if you're 50% survival probability, that's how long it takes for 50% of your stuff to go across the whole collection. It's about 15 years. And then when you look at it for threatened plants, that survival probability increases by about 3 years only, and that's whether you look at threatened collections as an accessions concept or a species concept which contain multiple accessions. It doesn't really matter. The difference is 3 years between them, and that's really important, because actually, I mean, we can have huge confidence not in these numbers as absolute numbers, because they're obviously affected by data quality, but we can have confidence in their relative measure. And so I'm very confident, and because of the size of the data sets, that this 3 years is significant. Like it's undoubtedly significant. So what that means is that as collection holders and managers, we are keeping threatened plants alive longer, probably because we're investing a bit more resource in them. But 3 years is not a lot, right? It's not a lot. It certainly doesn't meet the kind of let's keep these plants alive sort of for posterity type argument,
Sam, can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
Which is, I actually found this really quite fascinating. Again, working in horticulture and having a team who manage obviously a whole range of collections. But I thought it was interesting in that, I feel it's something that I can use and work on, particularly for addressing and acquiring more resources and being able to obviously demonstrate that we need to be, for want of a better word, doing a lot more sequencing in how we collect plants, particularly when we've got access to rare and threatened species. So, and that was a good thing to know as well. Obviously, it's not long, 3 years, but the fact that there was a little bit more duration or whatever you want to call it than that kind of the median of 15 years. But it's just a fascinating figure anyway. So just it prompted so much. So it was anyway, so much more in this, but I just wanted to make that point.
I think there's a lot in this, and I think you make a really important point, which is why we started this project 5 years ago, is that you will be aware, and apologies for any directors in the room if there are any, but you will be aware of how disconnected senior management can be from collections and horticultural work.
Absolutely, and I'll make the point that I'm an acting executive director at the moment.
Well, I carry the title deputy director, but the point is, it doesn't have to be. Directors are very busy people. Botanic gardens are very complex institutions with a whole bunch of tensions going on, and that's one of the reasons why they're such fascinating places to work in.
Yeah.
But within that complex landscape, collections need to have a voice. And one of the challenges is that we collect our data sort of religiously, but we don't mobilize it. Directors will be very aware of customer relations management systems and the insights they get from those with respect to visitor numbers and how to attract more visitors. They won't be using collections data in the same way, and that's because people who develop these databases and have developed these databases have thought much more about the security and sort of maintenance of data rather than its mobilization in terms of driving insight. And so we, and I'm not going to talk about the software package, but one of the things the software package will do is allow you to communicate those insights. And your garden might be performing very differently to this meta collection. But other things that I'm not showing here, I don't think I'm showing here. No, I'm not showing here. What's the performance of wild over garden origin? What's the performance of horticultural cultivars over biological species? They all rarely differ from them. This 15-year average is a very intransient sort of number. Even if you compare trees with non-trees, it only shifts by 5 years.
Yeah, that's astounding.
So we, it really shows how desperately difficult it is to escape from transients in our collections, and it's not just about the plants; it's about our systems. I strongly believe we have a sort of throwaway culture in botanic gardens. And we can do a lot with our processes to improve sustainability of collections. But there's a resource argument there for sure. Okay, yeah, so much to talk about. But the other really important thing to acknowledge as a general point is that, society tries to measure us in all sorts of ways. And as an academic, as a researcher, I'm constantly being measured by metrics that don't actually measure anything. But collections management, unfortunately for us, is extremely measurable. Fortunately and unfortunately, I guess, you can really measure quality in collections management from the data we collect, and that's actually a good thing. if we do it, and it's meaningful. And so I guess what we were trying to do, because there's a lot of negatives or quite difficult messages in this paper, was to try and show that actually, and there'll be many programs like this, but we took ICCP, which is the International Conifer Conservation Program from Edinburgh, and just showed that, when you compare and contrast a conservation program with the metacollection as a whole, you can discern a positive signal from all of that effort. The ICCP is more threatened, it's more wild, it's more genetically diverse, it's more distributed around the world. So that we can derive the signature of bad, but we can also derive the signature of good. Okay, let me just move.
Sorry, Sam.
Yeah.
I know you've covered a fair breadth of it. I just got the 5-minute for the meeting thing, which I was just like, oh, I'm so sorry. I was a bit engrossed and got carried away. If people are happy to stick around for a little bit longer, we might throw some questions out or just open the floor for questions right now for Sam while we've got him here.
Why don't I stop, and then, because this is more about how do we build a global data ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, and for also stepping in on such short notice. As you can see, that study is just chock full of really interesting information. If anybody wants to jump in with any questions now, feel free to open up your mics and jump in. Otherwise, I will put a few questions to you that this has raised to me while I was in the process of reading it. Is anybody volunteering? No? All right.
I'm happy to jump in, Tessa. Just
go on, Pete.
It's a more global observation, I think. And Tessa and I and others have been discussing this, Sam, as well, but just having an interest working in botanic gardens with adapting to climate change and looking at opportunities for sites to host exceptional species that can't be readily seed banked, all that sort of thing. And Australia, we're lucky because we've got quite a latitude or amplitude to choose from in terms of climate, but it may so happen that one country, there's a site in Australia that would be suitable to host oaks, for example, or other species. But the difficulty is that transfer of material. And so I'm looking, from a climate change perspective, I think it really needs to be some quite heavy hitting with organisations that have the power or influence to make a difference, like the whole Nagoya CBD International Plant Exchange Network. It really needs a bit of a rocket under it because of climate change, I think. So I think what your data is showing, and I know that some of this is at peak and maybe we can't do much more, but I suspect there's a lot of duplicates in botanic gardens that we don't need, and we could be actually hosting more threatened species, particularly with that climate change lens. So I think, what this highlights to me is there's a real need to have quite a strong push at the organisational levels where they can make it, where they can be influential. So that's my sort of concern overall. I think the data you've demonstrated really highlights that. But happy to be corrected or challenged on that, but I see it as a real concern.
So I didn't show this particular graph, but basically, I showed you in 1980, 3% of our new accessions were threatened. 40 years later, 4% of the new accessions coming in are threatened. The opposite of that is that 96% of accessions coming in 2021 were not threatened, right? And when one looks at we made this point in 2017 in the Mounts paper, that I think we estimated that 10% of our sort of horticulture and collections capacity is devoted towards threatened species. So we have enormous resource to grow things, and what we devote that resource towards, I think, is the conversation we need to have. And it's impacted by climate change, it's impacted by escalated biodiversity extinction risk, and but that's a conversation that really think we're having that hard. I mean, and at the level of individual institutions, of course, our landscapes are contested. And again, if you go to directorial level, we're worrying about toilets, cafes, infrastructure, how to distribute visitors across the landscape. All of these challenges, and within that, you've got to worry about collections. I took the slide out for this talk, but I think we have to acknowledge that one couldn't design a worse system for the storage of biodiversity than a botanic garden.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
They are despite all of their amazingness and the ability to bring visitors into contact, that contested space is a nightmare.
Yeah, I agree.
I was
going to add to that the idea of which it comes up here, conservation versus, which I think Paul Smith really grapples with as well, or mentions in his response, but it was about ornamental versus conservation, and that is one of the observations that I will make is that our botanic gardens are often that physical and visual representation of all the work that we do, and so there is this drive to make them look a certain way, very, very manicured, so to speak. So in a way, I think we do a disservice to ourselves by continuing to represent them like that. How we do that differently, I'm yet to kind of work out. But probably just back to the point that Peter was making, we do have KPIs. So for wild collected climate suited species, but again, back to your point, majority of that happens within Australia. We may get a handful of oak species to support our oak collection, which is wonderful, and we distribute them to other botanic gardens. But to get that is like almost a job for one of our team, to go through the phytosanitary, to locate them in the first place, to get viable seed, to get them through quarantine, to sign off on everything. To when we get them here, we kind of have this little mini celebration that, hey, we've got some acorns. So just making those points that we do ourselves a disservice in a way, and like you're saying, there's so many other kind of competing factors. Revenue is a big one that we're dealing with at the moment, and our ability to continue to remain viable to raise revenue. But on saying that, it's almost like we're seen and not heard in that collection space, and it's lots of challenges. But the big one is wild collected, which we continue to do, but climate suited, because that's how we respond to our landscape succession strategy. So it's we've got multiple drivers, I guess.
I mean, I think just to answer Peter's question directly as well, there's a really important piece of work to be done, and we've got a stake in this one, or something we're working on, which is really trying to understand the environmental niche of botanic gardens versus the environmental niche of diversity, and how the mismatch that's going on there, and how you can re-engineer the system better.
One thing I just wanted to add to Claire's point there about the difficulty of getting not just wild material, but especially international material, which has always been a massive challenge in Australia, as our quarantine is very effective, and for good reason. We are free from, say, Xylella and Dutch elm, but it is very difficult to get any sort of plant material into the country. And the way we were able to get any acorns was essentially a massive amount of really intensive relationship building, not just with the gardens in the States who were doing the collecting trips and all that sort of thing. Hello, Sam's child. But also with the quarantine department here in Australia, and with quarantine facilities, and with the courier company that was taking it all, because of course acorns, once they drop, you've got to go to plant them, or they're just going to start germinating in the bag and go off. So, and I think that ties back in nicely to the takeaway from COP16 in Cali, Colombia, where one of the biggest takeaways was that collaboration is the key to fighting climate change. And I think collaboration is still the key. It will be the key in its essence to shifting culture in terms of our practices and policies around conservation horticulture. Did anybody else want to jump in with any other questions? Otherwise, I might ask, acknowledging the difficulties in collecting wild and international plant material, what has actually enabled you to get access to that material yourself? Have you got any success stories that you could share? Because that would be useful to everyone, I think. Feel free to jump off mic or pop it in chat. I know there's an interesting thing happening in Australia at the moment as well, where it might possibly even become difficult for us to send Australian material out of the country. So, yeah.
So, I mean, while collecting is something that we've invested hard in and continue to invest in, and we've just appointed an expedition botanist, so someone to lead what we call expeditions. And I guess our challenge is, the challenges for us is actually much less CBD in Nagoya, which I think add a layer of bureaucracy, but is very negotiable. I think it is, if countries like New Zealand, for a variety of reasons, and yourselves are really limiting export, then of course that's very difficult to get around. But I think Claire alluded to this. Wild collecting is extremely time consuming, and that's why we've just hired someone whose job it is to do that, because it's not just the expeditions. And I think Peter put something in the chat there. It's relationship building. We interviewed like 160 people or something for this job, but they're all like Bear Grylls, Arctic explorers. They'd managed remote airstrips. And we didn't appoint a Bear Grylls. We appointed a dude that you could talk to.
Fantastic.
And apologies if there's anyone on the chat who applied, but but I mean, it's the relationship building and how much time is involved in that to build these relationships of trust and bilateral benefit, that are equitable, that it's not just about pulling diversity out, but it's about giving something back. And and it's really time consuming, and the planning expeditions, and then it's a full-time job for somebody, and the processing the material after it comes in. It is a resource issue as much as anything.
Yeah, and of course the thing with building relationships as well is you might create a fantastic relationship with someone in an organization, and then they move on and you start over essentially. So yeah, not just building relationships. I think we need to find a way of really strengthening and codifying them in a way that makes it a solid network that is between organizations and less the individual in that organization who's doing the work.
Yeah. And we've always tried to sign an MOU for that reason. So just to have an institution to institution MOU that, of course, has a particular person's signature on, but you can always, if there's changeover and turnover of staff, you can always waive and say, look, this is what we're working towards, and just try and get that written down.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just make one other point just about the paper as well. Is it's what 85% of botanic gardens are in the Northern Hemisphere. So I know that we're representing, but I wonder, again, there's data in like probably Southern Hemisphere, and even kind of in our own in Australia, but is still lacking. So I wonder what greater picture we really could tell. If that data was available, but and I know it's noted in the the article as well. Just that it's that a lot of the information does come from Northern Gardens.
Yeah, the fact that you sort of put the feelers out for 90 gardens and only really were able to use the data of 50, I think says a lot in terms of what sets a botanic garden apart from any other garden or park is essentially the record keeping we do. Without the records, then all our collections and holdings they're pretty to look at, but they're not useful. And I think we need to have a really big shift on attitudes towards record keeping. It needs to sort of be up there and as important as the horticulture we practice in keeping these plants alive in a sense. And
yeah.
You know how hard it is to get the general public interested in plants. Just imagine how hard it is to get them interested in record keeping.
Can I just read out one of Peter's comments? He's saying, I don't see that conservation is mutually exclusive of ornamental benefits, and absolutely agree with that. So it's getting better at, how we represent, a lot of not just rare and threatened species, but, some of the, I guess, conservation work in general.
Yeah, so Peter also writes, it's time for reimagining botanic gardens, and I put that in an email. I put that in an email to Paul Smith the other day. He's Director General of Botanic Gardens Conservation International, and so it's sort of preaching to the converted. But I think I said we need a new religion. It's sort of certainly speaking from the UK perspective, we have this. We're extremely good at botanic garden collections management. That we lots of things we could do better, but culturally it's very strong. Because it's been going on for so long. But the reasons we did it 100 years ago were a Victorian-esque, just collect and display the world's curiosities, that kind of thing. And that's honestly, we're just locked into this way of working. Without really thinking about why we're doing that these days. And I don't know how many of you, one of the questions around data utilization, is how used are your living collections? Because that's something we've tracked really hard for 10 years. And, the numbers are extremely small. We literally tout for business in terms of people using our collections. We've worked really hard at making our collections accessible and open and searchable and available. But at the end of 10 years, maybe 1% of the collection's being used. So what is the 99% for, actually?
Yeah.
Because it's not for the visitors. The visitors don't give a damn. They come in, they want to walk around a nice landscape, look at some pretty plants, then have a cup of coffee. And so the collection is not for them. On the whole. And so we've got to think about how can we make use of that 99%?
We have gone over time, but this conversation is quite frankly really juicy and meaty, and I'm enjoying it. So if anybody needs to step out, feel free. As I said, I'm recording this, it's all being captured. If anybody would like to keep chatting, I'm happy to hang around for a few minutes more. I'll just say now, once again, thank you so much, Sam, for stepping in at the last minute, for your little girl, for tolerating her daddy being stolen. It was so early in the morning. And also to your whole team for the amazing work you did with this study. It is a really powerful piece of information, and I'm sure it's going to be used as leverage for many conversations that are going to come in the future. Oh, Patricia, I'm sorry.
I think we've somehow got our time. I think time zones are really out of whack, where we've had people join at the end. So, however, as we're well and truly, that's why we record them, just because we can go back.
Claire and Tess, I just think it's a shame this conversation's finishing now. Can we run this again as a discussion forum and bring in some of that climate change challenge? Because I think that's a big part of it. I think it'd be good to see if we can get more of an audience as well, because I think a lot of people will be really interested in this.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as I was saying earlier, much earlier, Peter, we run this across different time zones because, we're a global alliance. So, we know that in the Americas it's 2 a.m. So, we'll attempt to kind of, get a time zone that might not be pleasant for us Australians, but, again, if we can have a much broader conversation, it would be great, because I absolutely agree. The paper it just allows me to think in so many different ways. And again, as a manager, I know it does allow me to throw ideas out to my team as well, but it goes up and down. So that's the relevance of it, that it's very important for the Hort staff to read. As I said, it's a must read for them, but it's also got so much in it for me to be able to leverage off and to advocate with senior management as well. So thank you, Sam.
Yeah. Just to add that, so the tools that are behind this paper are coming out. I noticed Patricia's just joined. We talk a lot. Hi, Patricia.
Sorry, got the timings wrong.
It's all right, all recorded.
And so the goal is, so we're going to try and release those tools. If you have people who can program in R, they can just use the tools, as they're made. But the goal is to host them on the BGCI website, so that people can basically upload their garden data and do all of these analyses on their own data. And then I think you can begin to use this data to really inform your own garden strategies, collection strategies, and so forth.
Fantastic. There's just a couple more questions coming in. Yeah, I suspect that the time zone converter I used and linked to, it's not actually account for daylight savings here in Melbourne. So poot, I'll have to find another one. I think another discussion on the findings in this paper would be great a little further down the line, so more people have had a chance to read it and chew on it. We'll have to have a think about the timing in that, just because trying to get Europe and the Americas together can be done, but it does put it as probably like 2 a.m. for me, which I'm just like not that excited about, but I could. But
so I mean, I know it's not just about me, but if you want, me or someone in my team is very happy to present this to at multiple times, right? I mean, we're very interested in talking through these findings. So if you wanted different fora or different times, we can do that.
That would be fantastic. And I think we've actually teased out quite a few questions from this as well. So and again, it would give you a little bit more time to prepare, rather than literally 24 hours, which we had to pivot very quickly. So we're extremely grateful for your time and your daughters.
And I think some more face-to-face is really valuable. Recordings are great and all that, but you just don't get the dynamics. So I think if your team, Sam, or yourself are happy to do another session and we can get more people, I think it'd be definitely very well worthwhile. So you got my vote of confidence.
Let's focus on that. Tess, I'll leave it up to you to wind things up.
Yep. No, I've made a lot of notes. We'll be talking about this, Claire. Once again, thank you, Sam, for stepping in and for this amazing work. And thank you all for taking time out of your day to attend and also just contribute to what is just a really interesting conversation to have. I'm sorry for those of you who popped in late, but this has been recorded, so you'll be able to go back, watch Sam's great summary of the paper and also some of the just interesting conversations we had around it. And I wish you all an excellent good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Carry on.